Let's bring in our guests. From Dublin, we're joined by Michael O'Flaherty, Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights and the former Director of the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency. Joining us from London is Jennifer Nadel, co-founder of the Compassion in Politics think tank. And also from Dublin, we're joined by Michael McDowell, a senator in Ireland's Parliament who served as the Deputy Prime Minister as well as the Minister for Justice. A warm welcome to you all. Michael McDowell, let's start with you. So 75 years on, is the convention out of step with current realities? Does it really need modernising?
Well, I think it's not just the European Convention that's somewhat outdated. I think that the international conventions dealing with refugee and asylum seeking, which were enacted in the aftermath of the Second World War and have been extended by a subsequent protocol, they are no longer capable of dealing effectively with mass economic migration posing as asylum seeking. And I think that that's the real difficulty that the governments of Europe are facing, and that's why those 37 countries are saying that they're coming under increasing pressure to deal with an effective distinction between economic migration and asylum seeking. And they are saying that the ECHR, among other things, and it's not by no means the only factor, because the European Union itself has put in place a Charter of Fundamental Rights, which includes an article about the right of asylum seeking, that all of these provisions combined are making it almost impossible for member states of the European Union and member states of the Council of Europe to deal effectively with mass migration and return of unsuccessful asylum applicants to their countries of origin.
Jennifer, is this really about fixing problems around migration systems, or is it really about making it easier for governments to deport people without them having to jump through or over legal obstacles?
I think something more sinister is happening, which is that governments are increasingly coming under threat from the far right, who have anti-migration policies and rhetoric. And so in order to head that off, governments are trying to appear tougher on migration. And so there's a political motive underlying that, which is that if governments can appear tough on migration, they can possibly see off the rising threat from the far right. But these human rights aren't about fashion. They're not negotiable. They are absolute. And the fact that they're unpopular at this moment doesn't mean that they're not valid and they're not essential to how we govern ourselves. And the real problem is that we don't have efficient, swift systems to deal with mass migration. Mass migration is only going to get worse, yet we treat it as if it's a temporary crisis. We have systems that aren't fast, that aren't fair, that don't lead to swift resolution. And instead of changing those systems, investing the money that's needed so that we can have a much fairer and speedier way of dealing with migration that isn't legitimate, we are seeking to undermine the rights upon which Europe is really underpinned.
OK, we'll put that point to Michael McDowell in a moment. But first, let's bring in Michael O'Flaherty. The convention, Michael, was created after Europe saw exactly what happens when rights become conditional. Who today decides which rights are still essential and which are expendable? Is this a job for our politicians or for judges?
Well, in the first place, let's not overtalk what's happening right now. There isn't some major initiative to rewrite the European Convention by any means. There's a political discussion among the states' parties, which will lead ultimately next May to no more than a political declaration. So the convention itself will survive this process. Let's see what the outcome will look like and what impact it will have. But in terms of the human rights, we must touch them with great care, and we must be highly evidence-based. It is not the fault of the European Convention that the mass migration, we're having challenges in managing mass migration. It's not the fault of the European Convention that we have difficulty in returning failed asylum seekers to their countries. There are not legal impediments to these things. There are practical impediments, like getting those states to receive back their nationals. And instead of talking about reforming the treaty, rewriting it, choosing which rights matter, which rights don't matter, let's get to, and I agree with Jennifer's analysis, let's get to the heart of the issue here, which is the way in which populists are hijacking migrants, are hijacking the convention for their own goals. Let's go out there to our own communities, our own societies, our general populations, convince them of the value of the convention and demonstrate to them it's not migrants that are the problem, and fixing the inequalities in our society, things that may want them to go to the right in their voting, requires an entirely different approach from our states.
Well, let's put that to Michael McDowell. Michael, why not reform the asylum processing systems, make them more efficient instead of tinkering around with human rights law? How do you reassure critics of this that it's not a case of mainstream politics drifting rightwards here under electoral pressure?
Well, there's two things to say about that. Firstly, I mean, let's be practical about this. I agree with much of what has been said, but I don't agree with Jennifer that there are absolutes involved here. In my view, there are no absolutes here. Everything has to be vindicated by governments in democracies. And you can't just simply say, there's a sacrosanct absolute system of values which cannot be adapted to circumstances. So that's my first point. The second point is the political reality that last week we now know that the Trump administration in Washington has adopted a strategy for international relations, which involves the breakup of the European Union and support for the parties of the right and the extreme right, to which both Michael and Jennifer have referred. And anybody who believes that there is no, it's not simply a matter of throwing shapes, so to speak, and appearing to diminish the appeal of the extreme right. The European Union, in the form of people like Viktor Orban and others, are pursuing, member states are pursuing policies which have, to some extent, weakened the union very seriously already. The majority of EU member states, even though they were members of Schengen, have now had to reintroduce border controls for travel between member states. Just to put it in context again, some of the footage in the report before our discussion here showed boats crossing the English Channel. 30,000 people per annum are making that journey from a safe country, France, to Great Britain, seeking asylum in Great Britain. Many of them from West Africa, the Maghreb, Eritrea, many of them from Afghanistan, some of them from Vietnam. And this is mass economic migration. It isn't asylum seeking. It's being run by criminal gangs who arrange. Those boats don't suddenly appear from nowhere. Each of those people is probably spending €1,000 to get to Great Britain. And for other countries, including Ireland, which is a common travel area with Great Britain, this is a serious issue, and it's not going to go away, and it can't just simply be addressed at the level of human rights. What's happening there is economic migration being enabled by people trafficking at the rate of €1,000 just across the English Channel.
Okay, well, let's put this to Jennifer. Why, Jennifer, is the United Kingdom one of the leading voices in the charge to modernise the convention? Is its assertion that current interpretations of the treaty make it too difficult for states like the UK to remove people who arrive irregularly via routes which are not approved by the government, the routes to which Michael McDowell was referring to them? Is that assertion legitimate?
Well, the first thing to say about the small boats crisis is that we've seen the same crisis in the Mediterranean. It's just shifted north to the UK, and it's shifted after the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. only 3% of small boat crossings, the total migration into the UK, only 3% comes from small boat crossings. And the reason those small boat crossings happen is there are no safe and legal routes for people to come. And it is not possible to sit here and say that no one on those boats is a genuine asylum seeker. That needs to be decided by a court, and that assertion is really dangerous. It inflames the growing antagonism towards those who migrate and who might be seeking refuge from a well-founded fear of persecution. So it provides a pretext for those on the right to argue that we need to restrict things, that we need to change things. And it's a smokescreen, because what is really driving the antagonism towards migrants is hard economic times. It's war happening in Europe and in the Middle East. And it is recovering from a pandemic, which has had a lasting impact. So we need to address the causes of the rising hate and antagonism, not simply agree that those who are fleeing are actually what's legitimate.
And Jennifer, if Britain were to withdraw from the convention, as several opposition parties in the UK have said that they would do if they came to power, what message would that send to the rest of the world, to illiberal governments elsewhere?
It would send a really damaging message. And in fact, even calling for the reforms that the British Prime Minister is calling for, along with the Danish Prime Minister, is already lending credence to the arguments made by right-wing and authoritarian leaders. And I completely reject the argument that rights are somehow relative and that they can be redefined at any moment. Democracy is founded on the notion that all humans are of equal value and that all of us have the right to life and the right not to be subjected to torture or inhumane and degrading treatment. And to suddenly say that that's just for a democracy to decide whether or not they want it is to completely ignore what we learnt from the horrors of the Second World War. It's a completely untenable position.
Michael O'Flaherty, help us understand why human rights organisations are so against modernising the convention. What dangers do they see that perhaps our politicians don't? And is there a risk that by resisting reform, human rights advocates risk appearing disconnected, if you like, from the public anxieties that Jennifer was talking about over migration?
I don't believe the human rights community, and certainly I am not against reform. I'm against reform that is not evidence-based and reform that doesn't put at risk fundamental principles. What concerns me greatly right now in the migration context is the way in which some of the polemic, I'm not suggesting any of my fellow panelists have done this, but some of the polemic would suggest, for instance, that migrants are criminals. There are criminals among migrants, but it's ridiculous to designate the entire community as criminal. Similarly, there's again in the polemic, including, you can read it in that statement that those 27 countries signed up to a few days ago, a sense of a hierarchy of rights holders, that some people are more deserving of human rights than others. And who's less deserving? Well, in that polemic, you can read it as migrants in general, or you can read it as criminal migrants. It doesn't matter. The idea that there are more and less deserving people is deeply frightening, because today it's migrants. I mean, the populists have picked on migration as the stick with which they're hitting our societies. But who will it be tomorrow? When they get what they want in migration, what group will it be next? Will it be the LGBT communities? Will it be the Roma communities? Once we've broken that principle of human rights in hearing, just because I'm human, then it's fair game for anybody. There are also some very precious rights at risk here, like the right not to be returned to a place where you face a real risk of persecution. This right has grown through our societies for centuries. It's found in treaties across the world. So, by the way, just changing that in the European Convention is not going to make a huge impact, because it'll still be there through other avenues. But it's an unraveling of the sort of a key that we have, this treasury of basic fundamental entitlements that we have just because we're human. Let me come back to Michael McDowell, if I may. I really also have to engage this issue of assuming that everybody's an economic migrant. undoubtedly many are economic migrants. No challenge there. But among them, we know there are genuine asylum seekers. And we know, look, they're coming from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Sudan, so inevitably there are people seeking and in need of international protection. They need to be protected. Those who don't qualify have to go home. And it's nothing to do with the ECHR. It's all about countries working together to fix their own interstate disputes over responsibility sharing, burden sharing. But in fact, the people who don't qualify need to go home in order to protect the exceptional nature of the asylum right.
Well, let's put that to Michael McDowell. Michael, once a landmark treaty like this is reopened and fiddled with, I mean, how do you prevent it becoming a precedent that allows future governments to dilute even more protections? Where does it stop?
Well, let's start with the basics here. There is no such thing as a legal right of migration from one country to another. I can't choose to go to Switzerland, except insofar as EU law or whatever gives me that right, and the Swiss government, Swiss people accept it. But I mean, there is no right for mass migration from one part of the world to another. You can say, morally speaking, there is a moral sphere in which migration should be permitted, but there is no such thing as a legal right of migration. Every nation state has the right to control migration and to determine who migrates in and who migrates out, and in what circumstance the right to move your domicile from one place to another is going to be vindicated. That's the basic law, and there is no international right of migration. So if you're dealing with a phenomenon where there is mass migration and those people getting off those boats are all going to claim, when they're confronted by the authorities or whenever they deal with the authorities in the United Kingdom, for instance, that they want to be treated as asylum seekers. A sophisticated legal system such as we have in Ireland and the British have, and is available in many countries in Europe, but not all, a sophisticated system has to investigate each of those claims individually. Okay. And it takes months and months and months. And then when it comes to a conclusion that somebody is or is not entitled to remain, it must have some means of saying, we're refusing you the right to remain, and you must now go back to the country of origin. Okay. And I just want to make this
very quickly, Michael. Very quickly.
Ireland is spending 1.3 billion a year accommodating asylum seekers. If you multiply that up to the UK, that's equivalent to 13 billion euros. People are looking at those resources and saying accommodating asylum seekers is actually diverting resources from other social justice measures in our country. So you can't get away from this at a political level by simply saying that the European Convention is absolute. If you do that, you play straight into the hands of right-wing politicians, and you play straight into the strategy which the hostile United States is pursuing to damage Europe and to break it up by encouraging right-wing politicians to get into power.
Jennifer, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Michael O'Flaherty, first of all, do you want to reply to that?
Yes, I do. Look, first, Michael, you're fighting with shadows, because nobody in this panel is claiming some absolute right of migration. I'm certainly not making that claim. To the absolute contrary, there's a right to seek asylum and international protection. That's what I'm speaking of in defense of, no more and no less. Secondly, not everybody, by the way, applies for international protection when they reach our shores. Because of the operation of the Dublin Convention, there are many people who are motivated not to seek asylum in a country of arrival. But that's, again, just by way of fact and reality. Third, what is the alternative to individual determination of asylum claims? How are we going to capture the situation of the real person fleeing from persecution if we don't do it on a one-on-one basis? And by the way, we're well able to put the capacity in place to do this. How is it that in the displacements of millions of people across Africa and the Middle East, countries have never claimed a need to reform the treaties. They've been able to put in place the capacities to carry out their responsibilities. I think of Jordan, for example, and the vast refugee and migrant populations it's had to manage. And last, if I just may say, on those figures,
very quickly,
Michael, that you cited, yes, those figures you cited, Michael, I'm assuming they include all of the Ukrainians, which is really a special case, which needs separate discussion. But when you take out the cost of taking care of those who've sought our protection from Ukraine, the figures are very different indeed, much lower.
Jennifer, 2 questions. Is Europe redefining human rights or retreating from them? Is changing the convention solving an actual problem or just creating a bigger one?
We know that appeasement doesn't work, and these changes are aimed at altering the way that these rights are applied and given effect to through our courts. And that's really, really dangerous, because what it does is it says these rights are negotiable, and it says that we can't rely on our courts we can't trust our courts to operate the law effectively. And that is exactly what the far right and what people like Trump are arguing. So for leaders of healthy democracies to be making that argument is a form of anticipatory compliance. But nevertheless, we do need much more efficient systems to deal with migration. And we also, all of us, have a responsibility not to conflate asylum seeking with migration that has happened during this conversation. And we cannot do that. The right to seek asylum came into being after millions of people died because they were unable to seek refuge in other countries. And that right has to remain fundamental, protected, and spoken up for, not conflated with economic drivers.
Michael McDowell, I know you wanted to get back in there. We have about a minute and a half left, sir. If the convention is changed in May, will Europe be more secure and cohesive, or more divided legally and morally than ever before?
No, I don't think so. I think that what's being talked about is in fact not going to be effective. I think that there is it may improve things marginally, but the fundamental issue is, and I'm not conflating migration with asylum seeking. I am saying that the great majority of people coming from West Africa to Europe and on those boats are in fact economic migrants, and they're behaving perfectly rationally from their own point of view. If they can get to Europe and stake a claim in Europe for asylum seeking, and if the court system and all the protections that are there can't send them home, then in the end they achieve their aim, which is migration. And that's the way the world is. I'm not making a moral judgment against them, because they are leaving countries where their economic prospects are very poor, and they're going to highly developed social democracies in Western Europe. Let's be honest about this. If we change the ECHR in the way that's being proposed, it will not have the dramatic effects that are being worried about here.
Michael O'Flaherty, I've got less than 30 seconds left. Would making the proposed changes to the convention actually deter anyone from making the journey to Europe and making an asylum claim?
No, of course not. The idea that fiddling with the European Convention, putting pressure on the European Court of Human Rights, will somehow change migratory flows would be nonsense. And it's important not to make such a claim. But look, let's just rediscover the importance of the European Convention for all of us. Michael McDowell and myself come from a country that's been transformed by judgments out of Strasbourg. Do we want to put that at risk for ourselves or for other countries? We'd be very foolish indeed. So let's not be careful of the consequences of what we're doing.
We could talk for far longer on this issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Michael O'Flaherty, Jennifer Nadel and Michael McDowell.